Greetings, everyone. My name's Joseph Campana. I'm a professor of English here at Rice University. I direct the Center for Environmental Studies, and I co-direct our Environmental Studies curriculum. I'm delighted to be here with you for this occasion, Cultures of Energy 9, New Directions in Energy Humanities. Although our symposium is virtual, we're hosting today's event from what is now Houston, Texas. We want to acknowledge and pay our respects to the Karankawa and Atacapa Ishak people, the native peoples of today's Gulf Coast, who lived here before colonial arrivals. On their ancestral lands, we are their guests. The descendants of the Atacapa Ishak continue to make their lives in southern Louisiana and northeastern Texas. We pay and we ask everyone today to pay our respects to the memory of their elders. An event I attended the other day, my colleague in the Department of English, Jose Aranda, also added this sentiment to his land acknowledgement for an event, which he said he knew was unusual, but he thought was very important for this city. I agree with him. So I also want to say, we ask you to join us in recognizing those US Native peoples, as well as those Native peoples who have traveled here from Latin America, who have chosen to make Houston their home. We pay our respects to the memory of their elders. Land acknowledgements have been practiced by environmental scholars and activists for some time. They're important. An important start, but only a start. And Rice, like many institutions, has much more to do. I was thinking of this when I was listening earlier this week to Akimel Odom poet Natalie Diaz. She is, if you don't know, an important language activist, a MacArthur Fellow, a professor at Arizona State University, and the author of 2 extraordinary volumes of poetry, My Brother Was an Aztec and Post-Colonial Love Poem. I want to share with you something from one of her poems that I can't stop hearing. And this is a quote from Natalie Diaz. If you are where you are, then where are those who are not here? Not here. The here we're in is always precious, and for a lot of reasons. And it's precious to be together, even virtually and in dialogue as we are today. This is the 9th Cultures of Energy Symposium, but it marks a decade of efforts at Rice, efforts that began with a series of conversations about what humanists, architects, artists, and social scientists bring to conversations about energy that usually orbit around another set of usual suspects from other disciplines, who are our great friends and collaborators as well. But we're really happy to shine a light on what these disciplines add to conversations about energy at such a critical time on our planet's history. I had the great pleasure of working with a lot of colleagues that I'll mention in a moment to plan this year. We didn't want to miss another Cultures of Energy, having had to cancel last year for reasons I don't need to explain. We wanted to mark Rice's contribution to energy humanities, which began a decade ago, first with a Sawyer Mellon seminar called Cultures of Energy, run by Dominic Boyer, Carolyn Levander, and Jack Zamito, my great colleagues, and then resulted in the founding of the Center for Energy and Environmental Research in the Human Sciences, which was active under Dominic's leadership from 2013 to 2019. This year, we decided to get the band back together in several ways, and we're glad you're here with us for that. We wrote to all the participants of Cultures of Energy Past to solicit thoughts and nominations for emerging voices in energy humanities. We also asked some of the founding voices in the field, many of whom I first encountered through these great Cultures of Energy symposia years ago, to return. You'll hear some of them tomorrow. So hearty welcome to friends old and new. I was trying to think about what to say to mark this occasion because these symposia have never felt to me like just another conference. And also, what is there to say other than that there are no times quite like the ones we've been living in? My husband is a Buddhist, and he told me that yesterday was an extremely auspicious day in his tradition, a day on which all actions are magnified. So I was thinking of the enormities of this past year, of the devastation of a global pandemic that seems to end for lucky some, as tens of thousands still suffer and die, the murder of George Floyd, the anniversary of which was 2 days ago, and marks also the countless murders that preceded and that followed that death. A bloody insurrection in our capital. Just months ago, the collapse of the Texas grid, which resulted in at least 111 deaths. And no, most of us are not willing to die to preserve the state's sovereign grid. All too much to bear, but also a fraction of what's happening on our slowly teetering planet. So my first thought talking to my husband was, which of these will be magnified in the year to come? So let me cherry pick one story or a few stories. Good news in a certain way from oil and gas, where most of us don't expect good news, and that popped up just yesterday. Yesterday, shareholders at ExxonMobil elected at least 2 members of the board of directors from a slate of investors committed to focusing the company on clean energy. The Dutch courts ruled to require Chevron to cut emissions 45% by 2030. And it's also sort of the case that we have shareholders voting 61% in favor of a proposal to cut emissions. Excuse me, I just misspoke. The Dutch courts ruled to require Shell to cut emissions, and it's shareholders at Chevron that voted 61% in favor of a proposal to cut their emissions. A cynical part of me worries about the lateness of such gestures, about the likelihood of follow through, and I suppose too, I wonder if it isn't much more a matter of profits than ethics as the financial bottom keeps falling out of the oil and gas industry. But let me say this, at least 61% of me has voted to consider this auspicious for our purposes. So let's hope so. The other auspicious matters of the day include 3 sessions today. One about to come up, chaired by my great colleagues Sean Smith and Randal Hall, Envisioning a Warming World. And all the times that I'm mentioning here, of course, are Central Standard Time. But I should also remind everyone, we're recording these sessions and we hope to have up soon the recording of this conference so that others can enjoy it, even if they couldn't tune in synchronously with us. So coming up soon, Envisioning a Warming World. At 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, a focus on publishing. We are talking with great colleagues at Edge Effects and Energy Humanities, 2 public-facing venues, but also to celebrate the launch of our own public-facing venue, Correspondences. So we'll have a nice conversation about publishing at 1 p.m. and you'll find some sort of links to Correspondences popping up in the chat soon too. Then at 3 p.m. Central Standard Time, a sort of session named after one of the channels on our new site, Correspondences, What We're Reading. We're delighted to be in conversation with Dipesh Chakrabarty of the University of Chicago about his hot off the, if you can be hot off a digital press, the hot off the press is The Climate of History in a Planetary Age. And I'll be delighted to be in conversation with my colleagues Simony Howe and Randal Hall for that. Just to say very quickly, for tomorrow, back again at 11 Central Standard Time for Emergent Ethnographies of Energy, chaired by my great colleague Gotcha Gunnell. At 2 p.m., a big plenary conversation about energy humanities, what it's been and where it's going, with Stephanie Lemenagere, Imre Zeman, Karen Pincus, and my colleague Dominic Boyer. And then finally, 4 p.m. tomorrow, Energy Justice, a session chaired by Dominic Boyer. I want to say a few quick things about the Center for Environmental Studies and give a few thanks before I turn things over to Sean Smith and Randal Hall. Our center is located in the Schools of Humanities and Architecture, and I also have the pleasure of working with colleagues from across all the schools here at Rice. I also have the pleasure and the good fortune to build on the previous efforts of others, including Dominic Boyer, who I mentioned, who ran SENS, and also Paul Harcum and Walter Isle, a biochemist and a literary scholar who founded the earlier Center for the Study of Environment and Society, and very importantly, our ENST curriculum. This year, the pandemic has slowed but not stopped us from launching some initiatives I want to share with you, partly because we're always looking for more collaborators. We launched a series called Planet Now, public-facing conversations in environmental studies closely tied to our ENST curriculum. Those live sessions are always free and open, and whenever possible, which is most of the time, sessions are posted, recorded and posted for later viewing, and you'll find some links popping up for that soon too. We launched because of the pandemic, but the accessibility of these has been really important for us. So we'll be continuing that next year, and we're always delighted to work with other colleagues and other centers to co-host webinars like that. As I mentioned earlier, Correspondences is launching, and we'll have a session on that this afternoon. And we'll also be the site of a very kind of exciting event. The Society for Environmental Journalists Conference will be the institutional partner for that next year. So if you can, join us in Houston, March 30th to April 3rd for the sort of important gathering of some of our most important participants in conversations about environment, which is journalists. So a few things that we're up to for next year. And just finally, a couple thank yous, and then we can get to the real business of the day. As I said earlier, we're located in the Schools of Humanities and Architecture. That's offered us for these last 2 years that I've been directing the center, the enviable support of Deans Kathleen Canning and John Kasparian. Many thanks to them. Our event today received generous funding from our Humanities Research Center here at Rice, as well as support from the Mellon Foundation-funded Diluvial Houston project. We have an extraordinary team behind the scenes. You never get to see them, but we are intensely aware of how important they are to us. John Waterhouse, Andrew Steffel, Paula Platt, and Eric Grandquist, thanks to them for making this possible. Sean Smith, who you'll meet in a moment, and who the participants have already met virtually at least, is the project manager of the Diluvial Houston grant. He's been a steady and incredible hand all year in all of our endeavors. This symposium is no exception. Everything from Zooming to website building to planning this panel coming up. So thanks, Sean, for everything. Finally, my very excellent colleagues who helped plan this entire affair, many of whom you'll meet at the panels and other events today and tomorrow. Gotcha Gunnell, Dominic Boyer, Randal Hall, Simney Howe, Nikki Clements, and Gisela Hefes. Thanks. It's been a huge pleasure to work with you all on this, and I'm really excited about the results. Now, happily, I get to stop talking and turn things over to my fantastic colleagues. Sean Smith, who I mentioned is an environmental historian and the sort of Mellon Diluvial Houston project manager, and Randal Hall, professor of history and the editor of Southern History. Thanks very much. Randal and Sean, take it away.
All right, hello everyone. I am Randal Hall, as Joe mentioned. I teach in the history department, and I'll get the stage first here to introduce our panel and say a few words before I turn things over to Sean. So I would like to welcome you to this first session on the theme, Envisioning a Warming World, the title of which must be credited to my co-organizer, Sean. We both share an interest in this topic, though, and a few years ago, we spent a year together in an interdisciplinary seminar here at Rice, where we explored the implications of the Anthropocene idea for how we should think historically about the past as well as the future. So this panel brings together scholars who have done significant work answering these sorts of questions and who are busy on more such work. As Joe mentioned, the center's explicit goal for this iteration of the Cultures of Energy Symposium on its 10th anniversary is to bring together established scholars who have visited Rice before and emerging scholars who have been suggested to us as rising stars. I think you will find that this panel meets that goal. Our format will allow each panelist about 10 minutes to talk a bit about their research and how they think about our topic for the day. We will then have plenty of time for discussion among the panelists and for questions from the audience, which you can convey using the Q&A function on your Zoom, on the lower portion of your Zoom window. So I will first introduce all our panelists, and then I'll turn the floor over to Sean, who will begin with some remarks about our goals for the panel. So Sean Smith is, as Joe mentioned, the postdoctoral project manager for Diluvial Houston, which is a multi-year project at Rice's Humanities Research Center funded by the Mellon Foundation. Sean received his PhD in history from Rice in 2020. His dissertation was entitled Race and Abolition in the Anglophone Atlantic, circa 1730 to 1840. As that title implies, Sean's work analyzes the making of race and the rise of abolition within an Atlantic world framework, and he uncovers the role of climate discussions in those processes. Sean's expertise in the history of science and medicine has also led to a co-edited volume titled Medicine and Healing in the Age of Slavery, forthcoming this fall from Louisiana State University Press. He has recently won a residential fellowship from the Schomburg Center, which he will take up later this year. Dr. Jason Hauser is an instructor in history at Auburn University. He received his PhD from Mississippi State University, where he specialized in environmental history. His book project is titled By Degree, A History of Southern Heat, and it links fears of the hot Southern climate to racial thought and its effects. The project is under contract with the University of Georgia Press in its excellent series on the environmental history of the South. His work has already appeared, though, in the Alabama Review and the journal Agricultural History. Jason also serves as book review editor for the journal Environmental History, and he has worked previously as an editor at the Research and Curriculum Unit at Mississippi State. Dr. Megan Black has visited Rice before, so I'm very happy to say welcome back, even virtually. Megan received her PhD from George Washington University. She's now an associate professor of history at MIT and a historian of US environmental management and foreign relations in the late 19th and 20th centuries. She is the author of The Global Interior, Mineral Frontiers and American Power, which accomplished the stunning feat of winning a prize from 4 disparate professional groups: the American Society for Environmental History, the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations, the Western History Association, and the British Association of American Studies. Professor Black has published articles and review essays in the Journal of American History, Modern American History, Diplomatic History, and American Quarterly. And her new manuscript, tentatively titled Short Circuiting Extraction, will explore anti-mining campaigns in the global 1970s. This project will document how environmentalist groups, local officials, and indigenous stakeholders adopted increasingly transnational strategies in response to bids of multinational metals firms to secure minerals underpinning a new communications revolution. Judith Ellen Brunton is a doctoral candidate at the University of Toronto's Department for the Study of Religion and an anthropologist of religion in North America. Judith's current project explores how legacies of oil extraction allow for contemporary imaginaries of the good life in Alberta. Judith follows how oil companies, government agencies, and community organizations in Alberta use oil to describe a specific set of morals and values around issues of land use, labor, and aspiration. She is broadly interested in questions of land and labor, secularity and enchantment, religion making, and method. And Dr. Jacob Hamblin presented at one of the very early meetings of the Cultures of Energy Symposium, and we are pleased to welcome him back to this 10th anniversary edition. He is a professor of history at Oregon State University, where he has taught since 2009. He received his PhD from the Program in History of Science, Technology, and Medicine at UC Santa Barbara. And he is the author of 4 books. This is very exciting. Most recent is The Wretched Atom, America's Global Gamble with Peaceful Nuclear Technology. And it's coming out from Oxford University Press with the official publication date of next week, June 3rd. So congratulations on that. His earlier works are Oceanographers in the Cold War, Disciples of Marine Science, published by University of Washington Press in 2005, Poison in the Well, Radioactive Waste in the Oceans at the Dawn of the Nuclear Age, from Rutgers University Press in 2008, and the widely influential volume called Arming Mother Nature, The Birth of Catastrophic Environmentalism, which came out from Oxford in 2013. That latter title won prizes from the History of Science Society and from the American Historical Association. So Jacob, from 2018 to 2020, was on the History of Science Society Council, and he serves as Vice President of the International Commission on the History of Oceanography. So welcome everyone. This is a wonderful, wonderful panel. I thank you all for your willingness to take part. And as our returning Cultures of Energy participant, Jacob will be our last presenter, and he'll be tasked not only with telling us a bit about his ideas on our theme, but he will also kick off our discussion by posing some questions to get us started. So he's our designated discussant. Sean, though, also has a robust set of questions and topics that he and I have come up with on which we'd like to hear more from this group. And so he will help guide our discussion. And my role will be to monitor our Q&A for questions coming in from all of you in the audience and to interject as many of those as we can. So I think that has let you get acquainted a little bit with what we have to offer, but Sean will tell us a little bit more about our goals for the session and take it from there. So over to you, Sean.
Thanks, Randall. Welcome everyone to Envisioning a Warming World. This panel opens our Cultures of Energy Symposium because we are perhaps the most historically minded panel. But by choosing envisioning as our keyword, we do intend to open the possibility of talking about not only the past, but also imagined futures. imagined in our time, as well as imagined in past times. How do we as scholars best make visible the historical changes that have resulted in a warming world, whether literally, as in satellite imagery and its uses, or metaphorically, as in how people in the past saw race and region through climate? And when we speak of a warming world, we also recognize that while these questions may have worldwide significance, they can be addressed at many scales, whether a key industry such as oil, a region, a nation state, or indeed the planet. Envisioning also points to the problem of how we as individuals can make sense of global phenomenon. While we can sometimes personally see the effects of climate change, such as the recent extended freeze event here in Texas, climate scientists discuss this change in terms of average global temperatures and large-scale weather patterns. How then do we as scholars understand the human effects of climate change, and how do we make those more apparent to skeptics? Randal and I asked this group of scholars to be part of this panel because they all examine these issues from different perspectives, ranging from the personal to the national and even the global, from a focus on the meaning of heat to a focus on the relationship between global surveillance and resource extraction. So without further ado, let me make way for the panelists to introduce the work. Jason Hauser will be first, followed by Megan, Judith, and then Jake. And please feel free to suggest any questions or topics for discussion using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I look forward to our conversation. Jason, go ahead.
Thank you so much, especially to our conveners for all the work they put into this. Promises to be a great conversation. I especially appreciate their wanting us to keep it to 10 minutes so that we can have a good conversation. So here's to hoping I hew to that. So my work is on climate history in the American South, most especially how ideas about climate intersected ideas about race and how those ideas disproportionately expose African Americans to environmental dangers. You'd think I'd be good at this by now, but my slides are jumping all over the place. There we go. Much of this research looks at race and place in the Enlightenment era and also antebellum America. And today I want to explore how Americans at that time made sense of their changing climates and the political consequences of their considerations. As a conclusion, I'll offer two perhaps tenuous provocations about how their warming world might help us deal with ours. And to be sure, to be sure, 19th century Americans did live in a warming world, but one that was warming in different ways and for different reasons than ours. Starting in the late 18th century, temperatures began to rise across most of the globe in consequence of the end of the Little Ice Age. The Little Ice Age was a global downturn in temperatures that occurred from around 1300 to 1850, during which time climatologists estimate that the Northern Hemisphere was as much as 2 degrees Celsius cooler than the pre-1950 norm. As the Little Ice Age came to an end, temperatures rose, though not linearly or even consistently, over the first half of the 19th century. But their world was also warming because of the expansion of American empire into the Old Southwest, an area they believed hotter and more diseased than any place on the continent. And they weren't altogether mistaken. The region was hotter and getting warmer all the time. The end of the Little Ice Age coincided neatly with the Louisiana Purchase and the widespread Europeanization and Africanization of the Deep South, and the settler colonialists and enslaved peoples who populated the area in the wake of native displacement cleared vast tracts of land for agricultural production, substantially raising surface temperatures. And warmth for these people was a problem. Many Enlightenment thinkers subscribed to the theory of environmentalism, which for them meant something very different than our contemporary understanding of environmentalism is primarily concerned with environmental health. In the early 18th century, though, environmentalism was what we would today label environmental determinism, or the idea that environments determine the essential nature of humans, of societies, and of governments. This deterministic view of the climate was hardly new during the Enlightenment, but it was newly important. Since classical antiquity, there existed an intellectual closeness between climatic thought and ideas of human diversity. People, most Western thinkers assumed, were products of their environment, and different climatic regimes nurtured in humans different qualities. Hot climates were at once enervating and agriculturally productive, a combination that conspired to create indolent and uncivilized peoples. In this reasoning, the ease with which the land provided for inhabitants made them lazy. The more miserly soils of the temperate climes, though, invigorated the human constitution by demanding agricultural innovation, and brisk winters inspired engineering advancements as Europeans built structures to guard against the cold. This belief found new life during the Renaissance and subsequently shaped how Enlightenment thinkers considered the relationship between place and human diversity as they colonized the New World. It led medical climatologists of the period to argue that Black bodies were naturally better suited to labor in the South proof of which they found in their observations that those of African descent seemed less susceptible to the diseases incidental to hot climates. But this reasoning wasn't confined to academic discourses or even just confined to race. It also shaped vernacular understandings of human difference as well. Indeed, by the turn of the 19th century, that human character was a product of the climate was fixed in the Western mind, and many began to consider how the different climates of early national America created not only racial and physiological distinctions, but also regional and cultural differences. Generally, these considerations focused on the differences between Northerners and Southerners. In the late 18th century, for instance, historian David Ramsay and physician Benjamin Rush debated whether or not heat bred in Southerners a predisposition toward revenge. While Rush believed that hot blood and high temperatures went hand in hand, Ramsay disagreed, though he did admit that, quote, irascibility was almost certainly due to the climate. Rush and Ramsay's early Republic contemporaries made similar proclamations. Congressperson William Ellerly felt that the South's want of dueling was a product of the hot climate, as it made Southerners more, quote, prodigal of life than other Americans. Lawyer Nathan Dane wrote that, quote, sons of a warm and debilitating climate lacked the energy and habits of attention and perseverance of the northern states. In another letter, he remarked that men of a, quote, warm climate tended to act without consideration of consequences, saying that a Southerner does not, quote, examine his ground well before he takes it. And there are countless more examples of that kind of thinking. But perhaps one of the most striking of these examples, though, comes from Thomas Jefferson, who in 1787 claimed that a traveler could, quote, know his latitude by the character of the people among whom he finds himself. In a letter to a French correspondent, he explicated the differences in character between Northerners and Southerners that he believed existed as a product of climate. He attributed Southern personalities to, quote, to that warmth of their climate which unnerves and unmans both body and mind. He summarized these consequences in this table here, which you do not have to read because Slate has transcribed it for us. In the North, they are cool, sober, laborious, persevering, independent, jealous of their own liberties and just of those of others, interested, chicaning, superstitious, and hypocritical in their religion. While in the South, the foil was the case. They are fiery, voluptuary, indolent, unsteady, independent, zealous for their own liberties, but trampling on those of others, generous, candid, and without any attachment or pretensions to any religion but that of the heart. The idea that hot climates rendered inhabitants aggressive, impulsive, unsteady, and even uncivilized worried enslavers who migrated to the deep South in the following decades. They were concerned that their geography might result in both individual and perhaps even widespread racial degradation, which would upset the premise that undergirded race-based slavery, the assumed inferiority of the African race. To sustain that relationship, they turned to an intellectual technology. They began to rewrite racial science. For most of the first half of the 19th century, racial scientists subscribed to the theory of monogenesis, which held that the divine creator created Adam and Eve, and as their progeny spread across the globe, they acquired distinct physiological characteristics. This was the belief articulated by Jefferson and others. But expansion into the Deep South required rethinking this idea. In 1854, Mobile, Alabama doctor and racial scientist Josiah Nott popularized a new theory of race. His Types of Mankind, the most celebrated work of racial thought during the era, articulated the theory of polygenesis, whereas previous considerations of race had generally found that environmental influences created human diversity, that Black skin had been darkened by heat, physical health and mental ability shaped by disease. Nott argued that race was in fact immutable, that the divine created 5 distinct races and placed each in a climatic condition suitable to their characteristics. The culmination of this narrative and the most explicit political articulation of this belief came in Mississippi's 1861 Declaration of Secession, which stated unequivocally that their decision to leave the Union was thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world. The Southern economy was peculiar to the climate, verging on the tropical regions, and by an imperious law of nature, none but the Black race can bear exposure to the tropical sun. Now, there are many elements of this story that contextualize contemporary concerns and conversations, but I'd like to identify 2 here. The first is based on Jefferson's assertion about the relationship between climate and human behavior. On its face, we would today find it silly, the idea that heat creates aggressive, unsteady people who favor the health of the individual over the health of the community. And yet, in 2017, the American Psychological Association published this infographic that states quite clearly that as the world warms, humans will indeed become violent, aggressive, and emotionally unstable. I juxtaposed this graphic with Jefferson's table in order to demonstrate how easily climate change discourse, especially when employing predictive social models, tends toward determinism. Both baldly state how environmental conditions determine human and social health. I am not arguing that the APA is intentionally being deterministic, of course. Their intention is to create mental health resiliencies. But it demonstrates how easily we slip into discussing what will happen to humans and societies because of environmental change instead of what we'll do about it. Seeing how Jefferson's determinism finds a new articulation in the APA's predictions of the psychological impacts of climate change highlights our need to temper these stories of social and cultural upheaval with recognitions of the possible roles of humans and human institutions in shaping the nature of those changes. I'm hardly the first to comment on the resurgence of determinism and discussions of today's anthropogenic climate change. Scholar of culture and climate McKillop, among many others, has shown convincingly that we continuously remove human agency from our climate change equations when we speak of issues such as forced migrations and war as a consequence of the competition for scarce resources. The world is, of course, warming, and we might do well to reinsert human agency into our discussions about what the future looks like. The other provocation, and another way the past problematizes the present, can be found in considering how the continued economic expansion of the Old Southwest imperiled human health. When Josiah Nott and others professed race immutable, they did so in the service of sustaining white supremacy. Indeed, these ideas sustained American empire, sustained power relationships, and sustained economic growth. In so doing, they sustained the exact exploitative actions that caused some of the warming and the subsequent human suffering in the first place. Any discussion of sustainability today must take into account economic asymmetries and must be undertaken with egalitarian goals. I recognize that I'm perhaps unfairly changing the definition of sustainability here. I'm uncoupling environmental sustainability from its meaning as ecological sensibility, and I'm changing, kind of leaning into the broader definition of what sustainability means. But I'm wondering, if we do go to that larger meaning, what do we find? What exactly are we sustaining? Capitalism? Sustaining human and environmental exploitation? Paradoxically sustaining unsustainable appetites? Are we sustaining global inequalities that descend from so-called comparative advantages? Might we do something different this time? Might this overwhelming, all-encompassing climate catastrophe create opportunities for destabilizing the forces that are warming the planet and imposing disproportionate threats to marginalized and under-resourced peoples? And that's all I have. I look forward to the conversation, and thanks for having me.
Thank you, Jason, for that. I'll turn it over to Megan next.
Amazing. Yes, thank you, Jason. That was so fascinating. And thank you, Sean and Randall. So many exciting things about getting to reconvene here at Rice. And I'm just looking over the roster of people who are participating in this program. And I have to kind of briefly just avow so many intellectual debts across the board to the amazing thinkers. Just to cite one example, I went to a petrocultures conference that Imre Zeman had organized in Alberta, which I think will dovetail. I mean, I'm so excited for Judith's presentation after this. And this was now, gosh, it was in 2012. So that was years and years ago. But I anticipate that the debts will just increase after our exchange today. So thanks in advance. So I'm going to talk a little bit, thinking with my first book about this question of envisioning a warming world. And briefly, I'll say that the book, The Global Interior, explored how the United States pursued minerals across an array of zones in the 20th century, in American Indian lands, in formal US territories, in foreign nations, the oceans, and outer space. And I showed that a surprising center of gravity for those kinds of activities was the US Department of the Interior, which is an overtly insular arm of the government that is well known for managing natural resources, the nation's parks, and indigenous affairs. And so while that is often understood to be a kind of inward-looking or sort of home-focused remit, I showed that environmental management overseen by the Interior Department had been global. So what does this history have to do with a warming world? Well, this is actually a really great question, and one that I have to admit I didn't centrally think about as like animating the project. Even though I have thoughts about it, I do think I draw out some of those connections, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to think differently about the work in light of this conversation. I'll just say that what I was trying to understand in the book was why and how the department had come to have a global portfolio. So first I had to see it. I was a grad student at the National Archives in DC, and I became very curious about why interior officials were in Afghanistan and so on. And this pushed me further back to the origins of the department in ways that kind of dovetail perhaps with the end of Jason's history, looking at US settler colonial expansion in the mid-19th century and the height of Manifest Destiny. And to kind of briefly summarize those findings rather than try to convey it all, I'll point to just one source that really helped me think through some of the key arguments of the book by an interior official who was trying to explain the department's global activity by pointing to its history managing the American frontier. So he said, once it was the undeveloped West of the 1850s, which constituted a primary reason for the establishment of this department and conditioned its development, now it is the underdeveloped areas of the free world of the 1950s. And he concluded that Interior had the know-how and skill set needed to bring about the opening of this new frontier. So I was kind of always testing that hypothesis as I looked at subsequent cases after the apparent close of the American frontier, a fraught designation if there was one, looking at moments when interior officials in the 20th century were then venturing into new zones, for instance, in the Philippines, Cuba, and Puerto Rico, beginning in 1898, 1899, and carrying forward, including through wartime cooperation efforts, international development, and then turning to other seemingly unpeopled, less controversial zones like the continental shelf and outer space. And that's where I ended up seeing the department's part in creating satellite technology that could view Earth's resources in different ways, which is something I think Sean was referencing. So a kind of history behind Landsat was one of the things I was thinking through in the book. And what I came to see was that US environmental management had been an all too easily overlooked mechanism, projecting American power, capitalist interests, and ecological tolls overseas. And in some ways, I felt like I was just bringing a lot of things into the same frame that had been talked about in other ways across these different subfields. But what I was seeing perhaps distinctly was that bolstering conservation at home was coinciding with offshoring extraction elsewhere, and that the Interior Department was actually involved in both processes. So it's kind of a flip side of the coin. So while I was connecting these dots, I certainly came to have thoughts about how this might connect with what we see as the twin crises of global climate change and global inequality, because certainly the department did have a central role in shoring up and promoting a kind of fossil fuel-based capitalism and fossil fuel combustion in ways that altered the atmosphere. It completed what I call crucial spade work for the expansion of this capitalism across the globe. And that was a process that offshored, again, these, what we come to think of as fairly dirty and parts of industrialization, all while bolstering America's prolific consumption. So I'm going to pull up just one slide to look at while we talk here for a minute about how the Interior Department was viewing the world in the kind of mid-century moment. So here's a chart produced by an interior official, a Bureau of Mines director, that estimated that the United States, which represented 7% of the world's population, used 70% of the world's oil. And we can kind of nuance that because oil had at this time overtaken coal as the primary source of energy for the United States, but not for the entire world. And many of these sources were domestic. I know I'm talking to an audience based in Houston. So like we have, I'm not trying to say that all of this was the world's oil and not the United States oil, but its consumption was certainly prolific. And one of the questions that I would like to use this as an opportunity to work through is, where do other minerals fit into this story as well? As we see in this chart, the US used 50% of the world's minerals. And I'll say that this was just a question I struggled with all the time writing about interior officials who would aggregate fossil fuels with other kinds of minerals, those that might be metallic or base or the basis of fertilizers and so on. And in their view, they rode together. They were non-renewable, they were mined. And in addition, interior officials were quick to point out how interdependent these were in a post-war growth-oriented economy and a national security state. So one example that an assistant or a secretary of the interior pointed to is that, okay, so military demands for aluminum required electric power, which required coal, which required mining machinery, which drew upon minerals and so on. And we can cite other examples, oil infrastructure, linking these sites of extraction to automobiles and the like. So what I saw and what I think we see still is that minerals and fossil fuels often scaled out together. And today reports estimate that metals mining increased from 11 billion tons annually in 1970 to 53 billion tons just a few years ago. And it's important to note that mining, I can kind of stop this chair so we can see faces again, but to note that this is something that in turn contributes to a warming planet in a variety of ways. These are tied not only to the fact that about 11% of global energy use, according to the World Bank, is from mining industries, right? Like it's very energy intensive to get this stuff, but also that mining affects the environment in ways that add to this problem. So diverting water in certain ecosystems, eradicating biodiversity through toxic tailings ponds, these undercut carbon sequestration efforts, right? So both direct and indirect contributions to a warming planet are evident when we look at the sort of metals or rare earth mining that are central to what one scholar calls the greenest and greatest technologies in this moment where we're thinking about a transition, where we're thinking about decarbonization. And here I'm thinking, Jason actually on my panel is someone who oversaw a book review I did of this Julie Klinger Rare Earth Frontiers work, which I'm kind of referencing here, and I highly recommend. So you might notice that, again, my set of issues are about scaling, about a history behind scaling out extraction, a kind of extractivism that is this kind of interconnected cycle and is one that we know spurred on certain forms of uneven, unsustainable development in particular moments over time. And Interior, for its part, helped to privatize profits, publicize risks, deterritorialize benefits, localize harms. It wasn't always and everywhere the case, but it was very often and overwhelmingly the case. Even as there were local forms of resistance, we can talk about labor organizing or environmentalism or expropriation, but I saw that the United States and its officials were very nimble at redirecting attentions elsewhere. There was always another zone to pursue, whether that meant within US borders, in places affecting marginalized communities, people of color, or beyond borders in nations, some of which were decidedly poorer nations, though these costs often remained offshore and out of sight. So I'm trying to step back from this and think, okay, what are some lessons that I'm thinking through in this moment, a moment where we are undoubtedly continuing to think about a warming world, but also looking to, as was very nicely framed by Joe in our opening remarks, something else as the oil and gas industries are facing all kinds of challenges. And part of what I see is the United States' willingness to drive and drive to expand, okay? So its willingness and drive to expand, to offshore, to outsource, and so on, has very often prevented meaningful investment in other ways of organizing society that might ensure collective well-being. It's something that Interior very rarely, if ever, did. I would almost say it's just very consistently neglected to envision a world that did not require expansion, in other words. And for me, it's hard to understand that without seeing its history kind of originating in processes of expansion, even as it's not meant to be fully determined by that history. And I would say here that, of course, it has overseen vital parts of environmental regulation. There's no doubt been great environmental and social good wrought of this department, but that it has left intact the structure that has driven climate change. And this structure is one that is based in fossil fuel capitalism or other kinds of extractivism, requiring and driving expansion. So I want to keep thinking about that, about this structure and the extent to which it might still be in place in this urgent and necessary transition to renewable energy without these kinds of lessons and thoughts about expansion in hand. So I'll stop there, but thank you so much.
Thank you, Megan. We'll now turn over to Judith to introduce her work.
Great. Thank you so much, Sean Smith and Randal Hall and the other conference and symposium organizers. Talk about intellectual debt. Like, I have never been to this group, but I feel like I'm among kin. So I'm very grateful to be here. And thank you so much to my co-panelists for their insights already. I was nervous. I mean, I just wondered what things we'd have in common, but already it seems like we have a lot that we're trying to say the same thing. So I'm really excited to have this conversation. First, I'm coming to you from the University of Toronto, and I have some community responsibilities to attend to. First of which, I'd like to note that the University of Toronto is currently under censure by the Canadian Association of University Teachers for breach of academic freedom. So if you'd like to learn more about that, you can search U of T censure online. Second, I do need to briefly acknowledge and express my gratitude for the land and its stewards that sustain me in my work. University of Toronto is on land that for thousands of years has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. As a community member at this institution, I am implicated in the University of Toronto's history and responsibilities here on this land. Also, for my current research, I spent a month in 2016 doing archival research at the Imperial Oil Archives at the Glenbow Museum in Calgary. And then I spent a year from 2017 to 2018 doing ethnographic fieldwork in Calgary and other sites around Alberta. And Calgary is on Treaty 7 land, which is the traditional territories of the people of the Blackfoot Confederacy, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda. Calgary is at the meeting point of two rivers, the Bow and Elbow River, which is a place called Mohkinstsis in the Blackfoot language. Also, importantly, oil extraction is done across Alberta, which is governed by also Treaty 6 and Treaty 8. But there are also nations that never signed any of these treaties. So I hope we go into that, haunting my talk. So I'm absolutely thrilled by the word at the center of this panel's prompt, envisioning. To me, the question of how people and cultures envision is both an anthropological one and one that lives within the queries at the center of the study of religion. Fundamental to both fields is the question of how people organize themselves and with what values they do so. Stories, symbols, and imaginings determine how people arrange and evaluate their lives on communal and individual levels. Envisioning is always at work in this dynamic. It describes the process by which the past is synthesized, the present is lived, both to enact a certain future and as a result of what logics are believed to govern that future. This idea of envisioning is central to how scholar of North American religion, Catherine Lofton, has described religion itself. In her recent book, Consuming Religion, she says, and I'm going to quote her here, "Whenever we see dreams of and for the world articulated, whenever we see those dreams organized into legible rituals, schematics, and habits, we glimpse the domain that the word religion continues to describe. Whenever we see the real ways we organize ourselves to survive our impossible distance from those dreams, we grasp why religion exists. Not because religion is that dreaming or those realities, because religion has been a word used to summarize the habits by which we demarcate ourselves as certain kinds of dreamers and makers," end quote. Such an understanding of religion has been essential to me in my work as I've endeavored to follow how oil and the work of its extraction lives within stories told by government agencies, corporations, and community groups in Alberta about how to live a good life and what that might look like. The habits and dreams that have contributed to a place like Calgary's oil culture can be helpfully addressed by considering, of course, settler colonial Christian cosmologies of land and its use, and by contemporary global spiritualized ideas of work and resource. Like the dreams of and for the world Lofton notes, these religious modes set conditions for imagining and envisioning. The following won't come as a surprise, probably, to many of you involved in this conference and its community, all of you who've done so much work establishing the possibility of even asking such questions about resources. But in the context of Calgary and the social imaginary there of enchanted oil, when envisioning the warming world, energy is the central analytic. Any envisioning of climate and climate change includes the idea about what it is that is changing. And for many people I spoke to as I did fieldwork in Calgary, that the climate was changing was not in question, but what they saw as unchanging was energy. It is this philosophy or theology of energy that I see as central to Calgary's envisioning of the world generally, and especially as it warms. Energy's permanence can be seen throughout Calgary, but it is really emphasized in Calgary Economic Development's municipal campaign, which they call Be Part of the Energy, which some of you may be familiar with. This is a slogan that is mobilized in lots of their development initiatives, tourism, soliciting people in business to move to Calgary, etc. But it is notably also the city of Calgary's new slogan, replacing the old one, which was Heart of the New West. This means that when you drive into Calgary, you are greeted with big red signs that say, Calgary, be part of the energy. I was, of course, fixated on this when I was in Calgary looking around for oil culture. And I was delighted by the opportunity to speak to someone at Calgary Economic Development who told me forthrightly on the subject of the slogan that, quote, it was obviously to identify our key industry, but it was also to identify the culture and the vibe, both in community and in business here. So it's really a double entendre on the word, end quote. However, when I asked if the energy of the city was then caused by the energy industry, so oil and gas in Calgary, the representative said no. They said, in fact, they explained the energy industry was one moment of many energy moments, and that the energy industry instead used the energy of the place. And by this, they were not just referring to the energy of the different resources on the land. They explained, quote, if you look at our history, it's always been a place where people, any person that comes here that wants to do something, as long as they are hardworking, they can do it. So it goes back as far as the indigenous people who lived in harsh conditions. It speaks to the CP rail being built through the Rocky Mountains, and agriculture is the same. It's much farther back than the energy industry, end quote. This belief that they articulated about energy existing before the oil industry also dreams and envisions an energy of the future. This future energy is one engaged with the warming world. The individual I spoke to reflected in our conversation about how they had felt under siege about the word energy in relation to the city, especially in light of environmental concerns. But they told me that they felt it didn't make sense to abandon their key industry and generally the project of providing energy, which they saw as in demand. They said, quote, first of all, it doesn't say be part of oil and gas. It says be part of the energy. And we are blessed with an abundance of hydrocarbons in this province that are underfoot, about which most decisions are made in Calgary. We are blessed with an abundance of wind because of our Rocky Mountains, and we are blessed with an abundance of sun. So this is an energy center, and it will always be an energy center, end quote. Last summer, somebody took it upon themselves to amend some of the big signs and benches that said, be part of the energy, printing off and adding the word transition to the phrase so that the signs read, be part of the energy transition. This is a call to diversify the industry in Alberta in light of both environmental and economic concerns, something provincial governments, especially the current one, have been hesitant to do. I obviously appreciated the work of this clever vandal, but thinking back to my conversation with the Calgary Economic Development person, I couldn't help but feel that the sign already said that. Be part of the energy and be part of the energy transition in this articulation of Calgary as an energy center seems to mean the same thing. What is interesting to me about how the energy of the past, the one that has always been in that place at the Bow and Elbow River, empowering hardworking people, and the energy of the future is shaped through a present imaginary of oil and its allegories. This oily energy brings with it its ideas of extraction, consumption, flourishing, and failure that shaped the aspiration to extract and use oil in the first place. As such, it limits how this cultural context imagines energy. Staying with this energy, working to understand its logics and dreams is essential for considering its application in the future. This investigation may lead us to wonder what other cosmologies of energy might exist, and even ones in that space, and how might they inform us in these futures. The person I spoke to connected the energy through time to indigenous people who lived in relation to this space, to farmers. Was this really the same energy? My sense is no. How might these different people have envisioned energy different? both in its dreaming. And in doing so, how might they envision that energy differently in a warming world? And to conclude, I think without questioning and broadening, I really fear the menace of the quality of late liberalism that Elizabeth Pavanelli describes in Geontologies. Quote, it says we can change and be the same, nay, even more of what we already are. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. I'll turn it over now to Jake Hamblin.
Thanks. I am delighted to be here, and I really appreciate going last always, so I can sort of gather my thoughts and also listen to some really great ideas from the rest of the panel. So thanks for having me back. I enjoyed my last visit to Rice, especially the field trip. We went to see the harbor, to see oil rigs, tourists, even people fishing from the shore. And at that time, given the role of Houston in the global oil industry, it felt a little like visiting the belly of the beast, provided, some on-site context for our conversations. Of course, now I suppose I'm in Oregon, still sort of the belly of the beast, not quite to that extreme where we have, in Prineville, we've got some pretty big energy consuming internet data centers. So maybe that's the new energy. Today, in our era of focus on climate change, the narrative is one of corporate power and the inability of governments to control them. We face that all the time. We say in our politics, listen to the scientists. We must have science-informed policies that leverage our understanding of future conditions to assess today's needs and today's strategies. And that's true in our politics, but also in the classroom. We talk about the evils of capitalism, extractive mentalities of the West. At least once per term, I'll have a student who quotes Frederick Jameson or Slavoj Zizek or whoever actually said it, saying it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. You've all heard it. And yet, to the historian, some of the lessons of the past focus on the role of state power. And there are some things that I want us to sort of maybe think about related to that. And one of the key ideas of historians of science, of course, that's my background, is that the United States relied a great deal, the United States government relied a great deal on science and technology to wield global power after World War II. And it may be that we have not yet come to terms with the role of environmental issues and environmental ideas as part of the rhetorical toolkit of states in the latter half of the 20th century. I'm reminded of curmudgeons, and I guess maybe I'm a curmudgeon, I don't know. I'm reminded of curmudgeons like historian Lewis Mumford. I shouldn't describe him that way, I suppose. He was influential, mainly in the mid 20th century. And he was no fan of corporate capitalism. My favorite Lewis Mumford sort of aside is that he saw what happened at Woodstock as just the most ridiculous thing. The people there thought they were these hippies, liberated, sexually liberated, liberated from capitalism and society and all that stuff. And he just saw it as a victory for the record labels. So he had a very different perspective on that. He saw them as all pawns. But in any event, like others, he reserved his sharpest critique for the power of the state, not necessarily corporations. The space race, the arms race, these are the kinds of things that he found barely distinguishable from the pyramids of Egypt. Totalitarian in nature, built by us all, yes, but presuming shared goals, yet who but the most powerful would select such goals. So the state is something that I'm hesitant to let go of. The state we imagine in this restraining role, and believe me when I say I'm all for it. I'm all for this restraining role on corporations, etc. And yet, who can deny the deployment of rhetoric by state actors in the pursuit of national power, of imperial aims, often reinforcing rather than challenging power relationships? Recently, Bathsheba DeMuth's book, Floating Coast, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, it explored the history of the Bering Strait, or Beringia, as she calls it. She shows very plainly the extractive capitalism of the West, to be sure, but with nothing really held back about the extractive goals of the Soviet state and the extraordinary urgency provided and utter ruin imposed when a command economy is so bent so completely toward an end. Megan Black's book, which I did read and I reviewed, is another reason to rethink our sure-footedness in framing narratives of extraction and energy responsibility. Though it has a reputation for federal regulation and control, the Department of Interior, as she showed us, has been a key facilitating instrument of capitalist exploitation of the nation's mineral wealth at home and abroad. I've just finished a book that will appear, I thought next month, but I guess next week, according to Randal, which may be true. I wrote a book that will appear on energy, in this case, atomic energy. And yes, it deals with industry boosterism to some extent by pro-nuclear advocates, but primarily it engages with state promotion of particular kinds of technological solutions, nuclear power, certainly, but also things like mutation plant breeding to design crops, irradiation of food to end hunger, sterilization of insects to control disease, desalting water with dual-use nuclear facilities to make deserts bloom, therapies for cancer. The idea is to speed up the pace of evolution, modernize developing countries, break the shackles of nature. Today we imagine that nuclear power can be evaluated as part of a suite of solutions to mitigate environmental pressures. We're all familiar with that discourse, to overcome the constraints of nature. And yet we neglect how the US government has depended on that exact framing of nuclear technology for more than 7 decades, as it has pursued all kinds of state goals, mineral hegemony over uranium or petroleum. It's protected its own weapons arsenal in that way through propaganda. It's managed the use of nuclear technologies around the world. And other governments too do the same thing. Most famously, they rely on that framing, most famously France, but atomic energy was also used as a tool of Pan-Africanism in the newly independent sub-Saharan states in the 1960s, Pan-Arabism during the oil crisis of the 1970s. The nuclear sector became and still is national points of pride in India, Pakistan, Iran. Many of those impulses are in the distant past, but a lot of them are still with us, including the use of peaceful programs to hide or distract from bomb programs, the continued downplaying of environmental harm by the International Atomic Energy Agency, the role of nuclear power's cornucopian vision in propping up the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. These are state goals. The title of the book is The Wretched Atom. And it shouldn't surprise anybody here to know that the term wretched is inspired by Frantz Fanon's 1961 book, Les Damnés de la Terre, which is published in English as The Wretched of the Earth. Fanon's book reflected on the bitter ironies of formerly brutalized and marginalized people being offered technological solutions. He wrote that they're wooed, they're given bouquets of flowers, invitations. To be frank, everyone wants a piece of them. That's what he said. So Fanon, the shortcut offered by technology, was a sales pitch, at best playing on naive dreams that hundreds of years of economic evolution could be overcome and skipped, and at worst, providing an inroad to other kinds of paternalistic influence, leaving such countries forever wretched or damned to continue the structures of colonialism. In the case of my book, it's not an anti-nuclear book per se, but what should be clear by the end is that the promise of the peaceful atom, looking toward the future, that imagined future, as Sean put it, has been used and abused and exploited for decades, certainly by industry boosters, but most powerfully by governments, led by the United States, but including many others, often leveraging the greatest fears, highest ambitions of peoples around the world. And it may be that today, it's natural for us to imagine a nuclear solution to present and future crises, as we do when we consider how to mitigate the threats from a changing planetary climate. But it would be folly to imagine that this promise, future of abundance, avoiding environmental disaster, is new, or that it isn't an irrevocable part of the global nuclear order. I don't want to lower the tenor of our discussion too much, but lower the intellectual level of our discussion too much. But when I was a kid, I loved this movie called Excalibur. I don't know if you've seen it. John Borman was the director. He's also the director of that weird Sean Connery movie, Zardoz. Anyway, as a grad student, before giving academic presentations at major conferences, I would calm myself by writing out dialogue from that film on notepads. first time I've ever admitted that. So there's a scene toward the end where Sir Lancelot, who's completely disillusioned with Camelot, looks around at people living in poverty, ravaged by war and hunger, and he shouts out, "Peace and plenty they promised, but what did they give us instead?" And this is, to me, a great quote that probably isn't nearly as transcendent as, of course, the kid in me thought it was. But for some reason, I can't shake the image of that scene in our discussions, even today. It's difficult not to draw a parallel to state propaganda about energy in the second half of the 20th century, especially as we spend so much time on the imagined futures aspect of this. To me, it's astonishing how often we allow ourselves to frame our own narratives in line with promises made so many years ago or over the years by governments or international organizations that are populated by government representatives. I'm in the position now, these are just some, I suppose, some generic thoughts about the panel and based on my own research. I'm in the position now of starting off our discussion of checking my notes, talking through how to make sense of a warming world using our disciplinary perspectives. I think that was my homework assignment. Well, my discipline is history. So my question to start us off is, I suppose I can ask a couple of them, but my question to start us off has to do with how we frame our narratives. I suppose the question is, how do you see your work pushing against or being consistent with contemporary political narratives? For example, in the cases that I mentioned, how would you see your work engaging with the role of the state, on energy issues? Or how do you see the literature moving in any particular direction? And I would say I have a similar, or maybe even the same question on the role of science and technology. Several of the panelists, including, the first, Sean, who didn't actually present, but I know his work, and certainly Jason is aware of this, that, a lot of these issues are deeply engaged in the embeddedness of scientific ideas in broader cultural ideas, including race and slavery, of course. So I imagine that while we all probably would have, remember the March for Science? If you marched for science, we probably would have wanted to carry signs that had an asterisk or a footnote, at the bottom of the sign. And the fine print would have read something like, "Yes, I march for science, but with sufficient contextualization, engagement with the literature, and critical analysis." Of course, you can't put that on a sign, or you might. And so the question would be, in our post-Trump moment of retrenchment about science and science-based policies, how have you encountered tension about how you yourselves treat scientific expertise in your own work? So those would be my sort of opening questions.
Well, thank you, Jake. I think those are great questions to start with, and I'll let the other panelists take a first stab at it. So feel free to jump in.
I can start, Sean, if that's okay. I have just some percolating thoughts. Thank you so much for that, Jacob, and for your review, which I've loved and I'm working on responding to and learned a lot from. And this question about what my work might do to push against contemporary narratives. I mean, on some level, it is as simple as saying that, beware the technical fix and don't accept the kind of narrative that it is apolitical. And I know you and I really see, I think, eye to eye on that point, especially as so many of the people participating in these projects are a kind of technocrat, they might identify more as technicians, as politicians, and yet they share in a lot of fixed and steady assumptions that I think I get to see and problematize with my engineering students at MIT, which is that one can engineer themselves out of this problem. And the Green New Deal as like the kind of contemporary container for some of those hopes and ambitions, I think certainly holds and could allow for a recapitulation of that kind of uncritical innovation and entrepreneurial spirit that has very often been posited before in the original New Deal, right? There's like a way in which it's obvious that this is a callback to another moment that certainly my historical actors were deeply involved in. And one of the things that I keep kind of returning to and processing now is like, what variables were they willing to change in their thinking and what variables were just the constants that couldn't be touched. And of course, like the where of it all for me was often the variable that would change in quite dramatic fashion to include the moon on some level, you know. But the variables about consumption, about seeking out new sites of mining versus trying to create a more difficult infrastructure around recycling and reuse, and other ways of organizing society, drawing on different worldviews, were very rarely, if ever, entertained as meaningful variables to play around with. And I do think that those two kind of lessons about, you know, the technical fix as always already political on the one hand, and then the idea that the variables, like what are the invisible variables or the invisible non-variable parts of the formula that have often guided state action in these kinds of scenarios. So I'll mute now, but I'm eager to hear from Judith and Jason.
Before we turn to them, I should say thank you for that response. But I you know, when you mentioned the technological fix or the technical fix, it reminds me of Alvin Weinberg, who was typically associated with that idea and was a big pro-nuclear advocate. And Jason, in your talk, when you were talking about climate change discourse, and you put that great map on the sort of Jeffersonian thing, you know, and how people talk today, it so reminded me of Alvin Weinberg because, you know, he was talking about how one way that this is back in the 60s, he was talking about one way to prevent things like civil rights demonstrations, you know, or dissent in the South, is because it's just so darn hot down there, and with a little air conditioning, maybe you might be able to mitigate this problem. I mean, he said it a little more eloquently than that, but the idea was certainly there. And anyway, I will mute myself now.
Well, if it's okay, I'll take it up there. Yeah, it's crazy how often that seeps into our contemporary conversations even today. The idiomatic expression of, you know, fiery peoples, right, are usually people from hot climates, and it speaks to a certain aggressiveness. And I'm certainly not denying the validity of the fact that, you know, of course, warming worlds are going to put very real stresses on agricultural regimes and also the human constitution. These are material concerns. And that leads me to consider the question you just posed to the panel about how our work intersects contemporary dialogues. And I would just say, first, my goal in this study is to show that throughout history, discussions of climate change and arguments about climate change have been political. They need to be seated in their you know, full social and cultural context, and also that they're not just scientific. I mean, you know, this is less applicable now. Yale Six Americas studies, so they interview people about climate change with the eye toward figuring out how many people believe it's happening, believe it's, you know, it's anthropogenically forced, believe it's actually a threat, and the immediacy of that threat. They found that, you know, most Americans believe in climate change now. But there was a while where you could actually just hide behind the science and just say, I don't like the science. What you're actually doing is, you know, that science is intersecting all kinds of other concerns, your economic concerns, your values, your beliefs, right? And so it was that keeping it as purely scientific was kind of the problem. And to that end, I think that when we talk about contemporary climate change discourse, and this also bears on these the World Health Organizations and the CDC's recommendations during the pandemic about, you know, mask wearing or not mask wearing and things like this, trust in these scientific authorities. I would like to see the scientists handling climate change, and especially climate change models, be a lot more upfront about the uncertainty that attends to their enterprises. I mean, this idea that you can just blame science actually capitalizes on a lot of people's misunderstanding of what science is. It's not a fact-building institution. It's one that loves skepticism. It loves being wrong, so it can be closer toward being right, whatever that might mean. And so what I hope to do is just make people understand that the conversations they're having, any kind of debate about climate change now is actually just a kind of a juxtaposition of values, a constellation of values, and not one that's purely scientific. And just in closing, I'll say that I really want you to make that sign or maybe a bumper sticker that I can put on the car, because I would love that. I think that's, or maybe a mask. Does it belong in a mask if the pandemic comes back? But it so purely gets to the idea that yes, science is contingent. Yes, it's contextual, but yes, it's at times trying to do its best, but its best is also a product of context, right? Its best is also shot through with political assumptions and political dialogues and political ideologies. So thanks for the question. I think it's a really smart one.
Yeah, this just like dovetails exactly into kind of my response, which is that I think, you know, there's something important about finding the hidden things, which is, I think, what Dr. Black's work is so good at, leading us towards and has done in the past. And I think science and these, we talked about sustainability earlier. I think these are definitely words that I think we know what comes next, right? Like, okay, well, this energy was bad, so now we must find the good one. But without really staying with the idea long enough to know, as you were talking about, like all the social things around it that might impact what effect it would have if we take it as the next step, or if we imagine it as the next step. So I think, like my colleagues, like science is this wonderful opportunity to be in communication with people, but at the same time, if we don't slow down and ask what worlds it's describing, it really can easily kind of represent and not even represent itself. I think people just are in a relationship in which it's like, okay, well, you've discovered one fact, discover the next one, and based on those facts, we will have a social good. But I think with energy, especially, like it's one of those things where if we stay with it long enough, we can see that it moves in so many different ways, and especially as something that we need to use to, or is being put in place to imagine a future. We want to really identify how it travels to the future. Does it travel through the future through aspiration? Does it travel through to the future because of expansion? Is it a corporate move to the future? Because that would really kind of lay out what it's doing and how we're using it to imagine our social communities into future ones.
Yeah, sticking with this idea of sort of the role of science and the way science itself shapes our understanding of energy, shapes our understanding of climate. One of the things I think I was probably first struck by when I was reading Arming Mother Nature, I don't know, a number of years ago, was sort of how patterns of resource extraction, nuclear weapons, things like that, how those patterns often come hand in hand with new ways of envisioning the globe. And I think all of your research speaks to this in different ways. I think Judith's probably on the most personal end of the scale, and maybe Jacob and Megan's on the most global scale. But I would love to hear more about what you guys think about those connections between the way we sort of sense the Earth, its resources, and how that's tied to climate, right? And both in the sort of modern Western scientific sense, but also in this much more personal sense, right, of the personal experience of climate, the personal relationship with these industries. So I'm just curious to hear you guys say more about that.
Yeah, maybe I'll just jump in there because I'd love to take that opportunity to talk about oil because I think, and what Dr. Black was saying about this kind of hidden minerals that are also part of this dynamic, the cultural repugnance of oil creates a social relationship in which then it's difficult to then imagine the other ways we are implicated in the things that warm our world. You're either, if you're not oil, then I guess you don't have to worry about it. So like that, there's that kind of social affect that really makes it troublesome to then write relationships with the land in ways that we don't have to worry too much about our demise. So I think what's really interesting about oil is the opportunity to stay with it and its affects and see new ways of imagining it, not as an effort to help out oil, but in a way to see that this relationship in which it was so repugnant made us put us into very specific social relationships with other kinds of minerals and other ways that we extract and other scientific, technologies and corporate opportunities. And I think I would point to Zoe Todd's work about oil, as kin for a Métis and Indigenous communities in Alberta that then becomes weaponized. So like, if we stay with oil long enough to have other ideas about it, maybe we would then be able to imagine other relationships with land in other ways. So I know that this kind of more abstract than you were maybe asking about, but I think that thinking about these affects of our relationships with all these different energies really helps us navigate what relationships we might want to have with them.
Yeah, I had my thoughts provoked by that, and I was just thinking about sensing the earth and sensing climate, and we think about energy choices, right? This is cultures of energy. We think about how much should we be relying on oil? How much should we be relying on solar? I feel like I'm kind of going back to the idea of narrative here, or just framing of the issue, really. We think of them as choices. We think, how much should we rely on X energy supply? But as the historian, I think about, I'm not the only historian here, obviously, but I'm thinking about, how much nuclear power, for example, is actually an oil strategy. And it's not necessarily one or the other. I mean, if you look at the 1970s, and this, I do talk about this in my book, but it's something that is broadly applicable here, where, oftentimes what you are thinking, not you specifically, but what we are thinking of as being this kind of long-term energy strategy is really just conventional realpolitik, in the guise of a long-term energy strategy. Putting nuclear reactors in Iran, for example, was definitely something the US wanted to do in the 1970s. It wasn't one of those things that we're imagining today. It's like, oh, with the entire time, the Americans have been trying to make sure that they are trying to control, make sure they're not building nuclear weapons. I mean, this was what Americans wanted to do. The British wanted them to do it. The French certainly did as well, as part of a strategy for making it impossible for Iran to ever reduce the amount of oil that it produced, because it needed to have bills to pay. And nuclear power was very expensive and long-term, and just like port facilities were very expensive and long-term. The Americans are, just like conventional arms, are very expensive and long-term. These are the ways that you develop these bonds of dependency, and nuclear power is just kind of part of that. It was an oil strategy, and so when we today think so much about energy and which technology is the right one, I just think it's A, more complicated than that, but B, sometimes you're actually looking at something that's very much about petroleum, and you're thinking that it's about a different energy system, and it isn't. Anyway, that's just my aside.
I love all these comments, and I feel like all of them are populated in the visual that I'm thinking of, which is the cover of my book. And it's something that is not just my book cover, it's the cover of a report that kind of links all of these resource systems, like Jacob is talking about, like Judith is also thinking through. And it basically is a kind of orb that's suspended in the void, that is covered not with continents, let alone nation states and political borders, but just different kinds of resources, right? It's the kind of atomic symbols and the oil derricks. It's also other forms of like implied mining and resource extraction. But in the kind of bottom expanse of the globe, I think here's kind of an important part of it, going to like Sean's question about the mapping here. It's a grid, right? It is very much the logic that whether we look at Cronin's changes in the land or carry it forward, it's a form of simplification and linearity, and a way of making tracts out of the tractless land, which is something the Interior Department was certainly instrumental in, but has been able to scale out, and has done so completely uncritically, right? Because never have they interrogated whether the parcel is a way or not to approach non-human nature, right? And the parcel in many ways became, in my view, what Landsat imagery does, right? Taken out of context, it's just the parcel to the 100 nautical miles by 100 nautical miles, erasing and effacing political borders in this way that gets back to the imperial, the expansionist, the state-led and corporate supported and led activities. And all of this, fits into a kind of utilitarian frame, even as environmental logic, other kinds of environmentalism, other streams of thought about, the system, and seeing other important aspects of the ecosystem can at times, be the focus, and at times they can fall out of view. And so that kind of selectivity is a key component, right? It's a global resource in a selective context. It's a global resource when it's justifying US technicians and others crossing borders. And then it's kind of, well, we're the ones who know how to capitalize on it. So now all of a sudden it's national led companies' resource in Mexico, but those are fine-grained details. And the final thing I would say, getting back to Judith's points, these are anything but reciprocal relations with non-human nature that are a part of indigenous worldviews. It's not something that is circular, which some of these materials, a way to transition justly reports are kind of calling for other ways of imagining the economy without just, growth. And map making, and I'm seeing in a lot of scholarship, and alternative forms of map making is being really critical to this process. So Tracy Boyle's amazing Wastelanding does the work of seeing DNA people's map making processes that center the Mount Sudzol and like non-human features, while the other forms of map making, do very different kinds of work. So, so many thoughts spun from these amazing co-conspirators here, and now I'm muting myself.
Might be a good.
Sorry, Randall, if I could, I have one more sort of follow up here. I was thinking during a lot of your responses of that idea that Jason had in his talk when he was playing with that term sustainability. And this question of what exactly are we sustaining, right? Sustaining what? And it seems like from your answers, we could talk about we're sustaining energy, whatever that definition is, right? Or state power or extraction, or as Megan was just talking about, land parcels, right? Like, and it got me thinking, how much of this is one singular system? I mean, I think in its current iteration, it is one singular system, but how much of that can we change without maybe overthrowing or not overthrowing the whole thing? Because I think, when when I think historically, I often sort of find myself stuck in these moments of big change, right? And so when we have big change, sort of how much has to change, right? Like to be successful in sort of moving on and escaping, sort of sustaining some of these things we don't like as much, how can we break from them, but still continue, to continue to, I don't know, I guess, which part should we keep? Which part should we toss? And how do we make that transition?
I'll take that up. So just some background on the idea of problematizing the idea of sustainability. That comes from my experience. Auburn just initiated a sustainability minor, and I just like to torture my students by making them question exactly what they're sustaining. But no, it has, when I teach that, it does lead to some really good conversations, and it does what you're indicating, Sean. It puts them in this weird tension between immediate change and long-term change, and then they think, what are we doing? Are we playing a band-aid, or is this a cast? Are we tearing the whole thing down? Like, what's going on? And I think that those are I don't have an answer. I would say that the question is, that's just a question we should be asking. It should animate the discourse and a lot more, it should run through the discourse, I think, a lot more clearly. In the same way that nuclear power was actually a petroleum strategy, so too is sustainability actually a capitalist extractive strategy, right? That's the nature of it. And being aware of the values that really run through that system, though, being aware of the values that undergird that kind of thinking, I think is important. And so that's why I framed it as a provocation. I have no answers, and I'd also add that I'm a lot more pessimistic as an individual than that little talk would have you believe. I don't think much is changing, and certainly not in the way that it needs to be. But it is something to think about. So I appreciate the question.
Yeah,
it probably is too big of a question to answer completely here, but go ahead, Judith.
Oh, I was just going to say, like, I don't know how to do the revolution, but but I'm ready if anyone has the plan. Like, I'm happy for that. But I think what your question really prompts for me also, just to say it, is, when we ask this question of how much do we want to change, what do we change, how do we do it, how can we live, what parts of the life do we need going forward, I think that really brings us back to your excellent prompt of envisioning, and how, for me, some other things that we do when we envision is, as we were talking about earlier, like, or Dr. Hamblin was talking about, another thing that we do to do the future is we promise things, right? Like, we promise things about the future. And I think if I'm thinking about envisioning, I'm thinking about promising. The next thing I'm thinking about is taking oaths and making treaties and being in relationships. So maybe that's the kind of thing that I think not only is it challenging to do the envisioning or deciding what it is that we change, but I think the question also exists in the exact tactics of how we do it and who the we is and in what relationships do we do it. Because I don't know how the revolution is going to happen, but maybe if the models by which we were in relation with each other in the land were happening in the very tactics itself, it would have outcomes that we were more interested in. I think what we've learned from everyone's talks is means become ends very quickly when it comes to this topic. And maybe if we changed our means, we might have ends we want, even if we don't know exactly what they look like.
I'd say I love those comments, Judith, and I would just build from them because I think they're so sound, and in many ways I'm just going to say it in a slightly different way. I wonder about respecting sovereignty and kind of keeping with your point about oath and treaty, because a question that comes in my thought bubble a lot is like, what happens if you can't offload, if you can't offshore, and if you can't kind of designate something the sacrifice zone? I mean, the scale of it, I keep finding that one can only answer that question on a kind of more localized scale. And often what I'm thinking about is the globe and the planners around these kind of sort of where they are looking and seeing a world of borders. So part of what I'm trying to think through is how we narrow the chains between the things that one uses and values and the sites of extraction. So like the consumption and extraction dynamic is kind of what I mean by changing the scale and localizing. Even as I utter that, I can think of all the 1,000 issues and problems with it, about what materials are within reach and not, and other kinds of hierarchies that reproduces. But I think people's comments today is, from Jacob's reference to Frantz Fanon and in Jason's earlier comments about race as well, like racial hierarchy is such like, what would I get rid of? I would love that. Goodbye to racial hierarchy. I feel like that's a good start, obviously, but it seems to me that I'm following scholars who think a lot about sacrifice zones and the fact that those are always already racialized spaces, or spaces that have been viewed maybe as wastelands because of the people who were allowed to stay there and in these violent racial processes of expansion. So respecting sovereignty is one thing I would like to continue to value. And that's my version of the revolution. And good luck implementing that plan, since it was pretty abstract.
If I could just add something to this too, I don't really disagree with anything that any of you guys are saying. The cynic in me wants to depict revolution as a cultural value, and wants to say that change is something that the stereotype of American culture is that Americans are the ones who are very receptive to change, and that this is kind of baked into the American culture, whether you want to talk about it as a frontier issue or usually if Americans have a solution to a problem, it's going to involve some kind of technology. It's going to involve some kind of change. And usually, again, the stereotype is that it involves some faith in a future technology that has not actually been invented or demonstrated, but a remarkable belief that it will in fact occur, whether it's feasible or not. And so I guess the cynic in me, it's like it's a good thing, I suppose, for Americans to be receptive to change. That's good. On the other hand, it also makes Americans very gullible about whether or not something can in fact, or I shouldn't say gullible, I should say receptive to propaganda. Is that another way of saying gullible? Where we have, we're talking about imagined futures here, and it's good to think long-term. I get that. On the other hand, it can also, you really, maybe I'm relying too much on maybe some of the conclusions in my book here, but it's when you're talking about future technology and future scenarios and futures, you never have to demonstrate effectiveness. It's one thing that is the great advantage of promising a technological solution. All you have to do is make somebody take a leap of faith. You're not held to any standard of any kind in terms of technologically actually being correct. So many of the technologies that have been proposed historically to solve environmental problems never came to pass. And were never realistic to begin with. Even nuclear power, which does in fact exist, Once we had, when the promise was made by a US president in 1953 that we're going to share this technology with the world, even the United States didn't have nuclear power at that point, but people believed it. So anyway.
This might be a good time to take a quick look at the questions coming in from the audience, which I think one of which can follow on nicely from your comments there, Jake. Question of, is there a consensus of thought regarding the confrontation of technology with respect to seemingly never fully imagined consequences, which are oft discarded as externalities? So can put that thought into play. And then there was a specific question for Judith that asks, I once heard Métis scholar Warren Carreau summarize indigenous thought about energy by saying that energy is, quote, a name for relationships we have with the land. And does this resonate or conflict with any of your observations about the Be Part of the Energy slogan in Calgary? So I'm going to toss those out there. Certainly don't want to ignore our audience and see what you guys think.
I might as well, since I'm thinking about it, I might as well talk. So the question about consequences and externalities, I want to acknowledge that it's true. I mean, I think that we do tend to externalize, consequences, whether it's toxic waste. I mean, this is a big environmental issue we are all familiar with, but dumping it somewhere and then forgetting about it. But we also don't externalize. We just don't recognize how we haven't externalized things. So having the state, again, having the government kind of have to pick up the pieces, whether it's Superfund, or the fact that we have no solution in the United States for any kind of long-term storage of radioactive waste or any of the things along those lines, that we do in fact pick up the bill. It's not external. It is something that is just not private. It's something that the rest of us do. But I agree to this lack of thought about consequences. I don't know if that gets at the spirit of the question or not.
I would just say I'm asking a version of this question about renewable transitions by thinking through metals extraction in the past, not the same cast of characters that we might be thinking of today. I know we have cobalt and lithium and rare earth elements, and these have different kinds of histories, that some of which were tied to nuclear manufacturing technologies, some of which were relevant to other parts of armament. And it's interesting to think about, the faith too that we have, moving beyond those kind of storage aspects that I'm kind of implying here to the land use aspects with wind and solar, we know being extremely land intensive. I remembered seeing the Department of Interior under the Trump administration circular that was so proud in minimizing the footprint of energy extraction in the nation, of course, reveling in its technologies. You euphemistically referred to, they don't say fracking, but of course, this is what they're describing. And so I think there are consequences that you're right, we can't fully imagine. And I think one has to continue being responsive to the things that emerge rather than the very often one size fits all policies that are wanting to put on blinders and refuse a mistake, right? And refuse a misstep. This was something the New Deal, the original one, certainly drew a lot of just criticism for. And I think thinking about responsiveness to stimuli is one thing as we move forward into futures that are unpredictable, even as we have plenty of happy prognosticators in and out of the state.
Judith, would you like to take a quick look at that question? And then I'm afraid we'll have to wrap up.
Oh my goodness. Okay, well, I'll try and keep it as brief as possible. And also, if any of my colleagues have thoughts on this, I'd love to hear them. But I'm really grateful for this generous question about, in Métis scholar Warren Carreau's description of energy as a relationship with the land. And I think it brings to mind so much how much this anecdote resonates, because I think it both calls to mind what I think my work is kind of about, which is the possibility of what happens when we create a interfaith, I guess, discussion about things like energy. And, where I think a lot of people, when it comes to the Western world, are willing to believe that, of course, an indigenous person or different indigenous groups would have a cosmology of energy, but then not decide that the one that people in Calgary have is also a cosmology, and that the interaction of those two energies is in fact a meeting of different faiths, different beliefs about the world and what's in it. And I think maybe this is not like an expedient or helpful necessarily solution if our goal is to like find some sort of technological energy, definition of energy that gets us to more ones that, you know, allow for more human flourishing. But I think it does get us to this question of like how to start being in conversation about different energy. And I do want to say, I think that this resonates also because as much as I think this is definitely a global conversation, and I think the global is enormously evocative, as Dr. Black has been speaking about when it comes to this, you know, in speaking about sovereignty, we also have literally different conversations about this in different places. And this scholar that's been mentioned, idea of energy will be different around the world. So it requires different kind of meetings of these ideas in different places.
Well, Sean will close us out with a quick reminder of what's coming up, but let me take a moment to just say thank you for these wonderful presentations and wonderful responses. We appreciate very much your being here.
Yeah, just echo Randall. It's been great to hear more about all of your research, and I really appreciate all your responses to these questions. And thank you also to all of our attendees who tuned in. Please join us for our next session, which will start at 1, which is on public-facing academic publishing. If you haven't already, you can register for that at culturesofernergy.rice.edu, and I will drop that in the chat one more time in case you're interested to register for any other sessions. There you go. And so thank you all for joining us, and we'll take a quick break, and we'll see you back in just under 30 minutes.